Welcome to the very first video. I'm really excited for this training as we're going to be going through a lot of really awesome content. So in this training, we're going to be covering a lot of destruction dynamics, learning to do fracturing, rigid body dynamics, a lot of really awesome stuff, as well as integrating all of this into a live action visual effects shot. And we'll also be doing a lot of photorealistic lighting, advanced rendering techniques, shaders, compositing, and of course doing sci-fi effects, pyrotechnics, dust elements, secondary effects, and so much more. This is going to be really epic, and this is actually something that I'm going to be introducing a lot of effects elements and techniques that are very similar to the work that I've done, let's say, on Avengers Endgame as one example of a movie recently. The exact process that I use to create a lot of destruction and fragmentation and effects like that, we'll be using that exact process here for doing all the city destruction as well. Now, the way that I want to do this is as I build these videos up, I'm going to try to get these out every 1 to 2 days. So in other words, as I upload these lessons, I'll be sending out an email usually every 1 or 2 days with the latest lesson. And this will give you a chance to go through the training and make the most of it while you can. Now, as I mentioned before, this training won't be up forever. Usually what I do is I'll post the training, we'll go through it, and then at the very end, once we complete the lessons, usually at that point, I'm going to take the training back down again. And this is something that I regularly do because I hate, I'm going to say it, I loathe when people see some new training and they go, oh cool, I'm going to get that. They download it and it just ends up gathering dust on their hard drive. So the whole point is that I want us to go through this training together. I want to use this to kind of force you to kick your butt to do the training and make the most of it. For me, I want this to be results driven. I want you to take advantage of this and really level up your skill. It's so easy to start something. It's a lot more difficult to actually finish it. Okay, so I'm going to really try and push you as much as I can as we go through this training. Now, I won't lie, for me, I'm constantly looking for good effects artists to hire. And if you're someone that goes through this training and you do a really great job and you send me your work, I want to see it. I want to know if you're good enough, someone that I would want to work with, or someone that I can recommend. So again, as you go through this training, the more that you can demonstrate that you can do fracturing, dynamics, pyro, dust elements, all the particle effects, compositing, rendering, and lighting, all of these different things, this is a chance for you to show off what you can do, and potentially it might be a chance for me to say, hey, you show a lot of talent and you could be someone that I want to keep an eye on for the future. Effects specifically is one of the highest paying areas inside of the visual effects industry, and I think it's something that if you want to learn effects is definitely a very promising career. I know some artists that are making up to $100 an hour, some very few, but I know a couple who are making $150 an hour. Like, this is a very high in demand and low in supply industry, but like I said, it requires you to do the work, for you to really be able to step up and demonstrate that you have the ability, the understanding to really pull this off. And this is why I'm giving such a harsh little kind of talk here, because it's very easy to start saying, great, I'm going to check out some new training, and then even within the first video, see another shiny thing and move on to that. I wouldn't be putting out all of the training, all the 8 videos, almost 20 hours of training here if it wasn't because I want you to level up your skills. I want you to make that commitment and say, I'm going to take this seriously, I'm going to commit to it, and I'm going to see it through to the end. So keep that in mind, that if you're serious about a visual effects career, you're going to need to do the hard yards. You're going to have to put in the work. It's going to be difficult, and you're going to have to really push yourself at times. So be prepared for that. Nothing easy is worth doing. So make this commitment to yourself that you're going to make time this week to do the training, to see these lessons through, and to give it everything you've got, and expect there to be a resistance. Expect you to run into problems that you need to solve and things you need to figure out. That's part of visual effects. And the more you put in, the more you'll get out. So I'm really excited for this course. I'm really excited for this training as we go through it. And the last thing I want to mention is I want to encourage you as much as I can. I'm busy running a studio, working on films. I've got a lot of travel coming up this week, but I still want to try and find time where I can. So as you finish these lessons and create your simulations, make previews, make renders, feel free to post these online on Vimeo or YouTube or Instagram, LinkedIn, wherever you want. And feel free to tag me in them. I'd love to see your work, and if I have time, if I have a moment, I'd love to give some encouraging words or maybe answer questions, critique your work, whatever I can do. So feel free to add me on any of these platforms, feel free to tag me in posts that you submit. And I think it's really important for you to build that habit to continuously post your work in progress, because then you'll be able to look back and see how much you've improved with every single lesson. And getting that encouragement from everyone else when people see how cool the work that you're doing is, it's going to encourage you to continue to keep moving forward. Okay, so that's something that I do regularly where I can, because I know that it makes me stay consistent in the training, in improving on myself. So that being said, let's get into the first lesson. We're going to dive right into setting up our shot. We're going to be building out a lot of destruction dynamics, a lot of really cool stuff, and I cannot wait to see what you do. Like I said, feel free to tag me in any post. I would love to see all the effects that you create. Let's get started. Okay, so now we're in 3D. This is what we're dealing with. This is our city. So it might look pretty basic, but this has actually been constructed specifically to match our camera. So let me just update the viewport. Basically, if I scrub through here, we can see that the geometry matches pretty accurately. It's not 100%, but pretty accurately to the live action plate. Okay, so the plate, when I refer to a plate, it's footage. I'm going to try and cram a lot into a very small amount of time. So yeah, but basically this is all set up specifically for dynamics. So rather than it being like something that you might see on a Turbo Squid model or something like that, this is built with layers in mind. So if you actually go to the layer manager, they aren't named correctly, but that's just because I tend to just use layers for everything. So this is the environment, and if we open the environments, this is the layer manager, this is the environment here. We have the ground, which is actually the ramp and the ground here, whereas here we have like the building floors for everything. We also have like the pillars. I'll explain what the pillars are in a moment. We also have the pipe. I'll explain what that is in a moment, and we have walls. So the naming of this isn't ideal, but for the most part, this is a way that we can kind of section everything off very easily. So if I turn everything back on, this is what it looks like. Now there is a pipe, and that's because I wanted the option, if we wanted to do it, we could do like a soft body simulation of this part of the footage. Okay, so this could be something cool where we could actually have that pipe there bend up and kind of remove itself as a solid piece rather than breaking or anything like that. I think time-wise, because we're trying to do so much in these lessons, and I want to try and get these out as quick as I can, we probably will just kind of treat this as something that fragments and breaks as well, rather than do anything too tricky with it. But ideally, that would be something I think would be really cool. So one thing I did mention is the pillars. Now, pillars is something that I typically do just as an option. I don't always use them, but usually you're gonna have the ceiling and you're gonna have the floor, and there's a big gap in between them. And I sometimes like to have something to kind of interconnect them. So I like the idea of having pillars, because I could have, if I draw on my screen for a second, I could have you know, a particle up here for the ceiling, a particle on the ground, and there's no way for these two levels to really communicate if one's going to break, and I might want the ground below it to break as well or something. So having these kind of like points in the middle here would mean that I could transfer energy down that pillar to hit the ground here. So it could cause like a fracture on the ground, you know, spreading out or whatever, coming from the ceiling. You know, whatever I wanted to do, I just like having that kind of extra control, as well as just extra debris, things like that. If this was a closer shot, in other words, if this was something a bit closer than here, I would also consider doing dividers like I would in an office, as well as like chairs, desks, whatever kind of interior stuff that I can do, just going to make it a bit more interesting as well. But because it's so far away, I don't think that we're going to need that attention to detail in this setup. So this is generally how it's all set up. There's a couple of things I'm going to adjust here, though. I do like the idea of having these ceilings being separate, okay? So having them as separate geometry to everything else. So I'm just going to select and hold down Control and select a few more items. And I'm going to keep doing this, but I'm just going to quickly click the create new layer, and I'm going to call this roof, and then drag this up into environment. And this just means we have now a roof layer, and I can turn that off very easily. It's the same deal. I'm going to select more items and just drag them into the roof. So, I'm just going to have a bit more control over the roof specifically, and then everything else. Now, the way this is set up, the roof here actually goes in. Like, there's a few things that I would do differently in hindsight, but ideally, this works. It will work out well for what we're doing. Now we have that roof layer. I also want to set everything up so that way it all has a material ID of 1. So that's really easy. I'm just going to select everything. Let me just do it in the viewport. I'm just going to select all the geometry. I'm going to select everything here. I'm just going to holding Control to select more. Alright, so with all of that selected, I'm just going to apply a material, which is a material ID. And this is going to set it to material ID of 1. Alright, and it's going to right click and say collapse. And that's just going to collapse the history down, so it's just a regular mesh. So it's kind of like deleting the history in Maya if you're coming from there. So I just get a poly at the end of it. So all I've done is I've set this up so that way the material IDs are all set to 1. Now, I'm going to go into my material editor, so I'm just clicking material editor. Let's just set up a multi-sub-object material. So in other words, I just want to set up a shader where I can see the material IDs as we set them up. So I'm just going to type in here so just get here multi-sub-object. Okay, so that's all I'm looking for. It's under materials. You'll see like multi-sub-object. All right, so set number to 3. So just clicking that. The reason for this is I'm going to set up multiple material IDs for different faces, and I want to be able to see what I'm doing. So let's just go to the first one, click, and choose standard. Go back up, do it again, and just dragging, choose copy. Do it again, copy. So I've got 3 things on there. Just going to double click environment, click assign, so everything's done. Now I'm just going to change the default material to like a dark gray. All right, so it's just something simple that we can see. The next one though, I'm going to set this to, I guess, to red. All right, and then the final one, let's set that to like blue. Doesn't matter what colors, so go wild. It's just I want distinct colors to kind of represent what I'm looking at. Okay, the reason for this is that I want to set up some projections. So rather than texturing all this and trying to make it photoreal, because again, this is something that like in the live action series, the course that I run, that's like a year-long course that we go through so much stuff. We literally spend a year doing like over 500 hours of training, and we go over a lot of in-depth stuff with creating photoreal shots that are completely CG in some regards. We're doing a lot of different things. Here, I want to kind of cut corners where I can, and the reason is I want to get the most bang for our buck. In other words, we don't have too much time. I want to make the right decisions as we go through this so we can get the best results, keeping in mind that this is a fast turnaround. So the way that I'm approaching this is that I'm going to treat it like this is a 9/11 job. So in other words, a project came in, they're like, hey, we had another team of people working on this. It wasn't really working out. We now have like 3 days to get all these shots done. And I had that in like Star Trek where I had 2 days, I think, to create an entire, like, I forget how long that shot went for. It was like 40 seconds. It's pretty much, almost all CG. Yeah, just very, had to be photoreal. Fire, smoke, debris, dust, you name it. Like, all this kind of stuff that we need to be, putting out the highest quality, but in the fastest amount of time. So I'm going to cut corners where I can. So the thing is, if we look at this is the footage. Obviously in the viewport it degrades a little bit, but this is, textured and everything correctly, obviously. So I'm going to project that onto this geometry. But I can't project it onto everything because something on top, let's say, isn't going to get a texture accurately because it's being projected from the camera. So that's the sort of thing that I will need to do separately. But for this, for now, I'm going to basically go in And I might just select like everything pretty much. So I won't select the ground or anything, but when it comes to, let's turn off the pipes, turn off the floor, turn off the ground, so turn off the pillars. So we just have roofs and walls, okay? So that's all that's visible right now. I'm just going to select all of this. I'm going to hit poly select. So where are we? Poly select. Click polygon. Let's deselect everything. Let's just go into the viewport here, okay? So I'm in the modify panel right now, and I'm just going to start selecting polys that are visible from the camera. Okay, I'm going to be pretty careful about this. I'm just choosing polygons that, I can see are visible from the camera's viewport. So this is just going to give me a better idea of, like, you know, if I were to use the plate, the footage, what is going to get projected. I'm going to do the roof in a moment just because it's a bit more intricate, so I want a bit more control there. So not overdoing it, but just wherever I think I'm going to see geometry. Alright, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to swap viewports, and let's just do the ceiling. And if I really need to, I can have, you know, these two side by side, so I can just kind of see it a bit better. But basically, I'm just going to look for whatever's visible. Alright, almost done. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. We basically just selected everything that looks visible. I just want to make sure this, yeah, okay, so that is visible. Okay, so basically we would be projecting the footage based on this. So what I want to do, first of all, I'm going to create a selection set, and that allows me to be able to select these objects anytime I want, okay? So in fact, I'll do that in a moment. Let me just quickly apply that material modifier again, but this time choose 2. So this means that this is material ID 2, whereas everything else we set was 1. So it means anything I've selected right now will show up as material ID 2. So let's do that for a second. Now when we deselect this, we can see that the red, so in other words, we bring the shader here, material ID 2 is the projection. Okay, so this is everything that will get projected. So if I were to look through this viewport, I'm not really seeing any gray. I'm only seeing the red because that's all that's visible, okay, and that's all that I want. So this is just my way of saying, all right, this is what's going to use the footage. Any other geometry from different angles or anything like that are all going to be using material ID 1 because it's what we set up. Now I'm just going to undo, so I just undid that so my selection's still there. I'm going to type in projection objects, okay? Now I put this in here, so if I deselect it, if I want to get this selection back, I can just click and choose projection objects, and it brings back my selection each time. So it's just an easy way for me to jump back in and have everything set up. And then from there, I could also put on like a camera map modifier and put camera map, go select by name. Let me just make sure my camera is visible. So if we go to cameras, again, just selection set, pick camera, and then go down and choose the camera. All right. Now we can see camera 001. All right. So that's kind of handy because it means that now this is projecting the footage onto it. All right, so this will be really handy for us for later on. So we've just did the selection, set up a different material ID for it, and then set up the projection as well. So that way it's projecting based on the angle of the camera. Finally, let's look at this camera for a second. Right now I just called it camera 001. Let's give it a better name. If I just right click on the play button, we can see the time configuration. The frame range is 70 to 414. So let's actually put that in here. This shot code is 005037. Okay, now the way that I'm pulling the shot code in this case, this isn't what I would do typically, but I just wanted to give it a name. So I actually use, like, if you're familiar with red, when you're shooting on any, like a red epic, let's say A005, you know, typically it's like A number and then the sequence. So A005 and then 037, because it's like, you know, 37th take on that SSD card, or however the EDL set up. So in this case, let's just put SH and then 005 037, put SH underscore, and then finally in brackets, square brackets, I'm going to put the frame range. So I think it was 70, and what was it, 414. So this is really handy because there's going to be times, I'm going to put underscore there as well. So this can be handy at times because you might pull in a camera and you're doing a custom shot and you're like, what's the frame length? And you got to go into Shotgun and dig that information up. So this is one of those situations where having that is really vital, just so that way you're not second guessing yourself. At the same time, it's very useful for when, let's say you merge an asset into a new scene, and you accidentally have your scene file set up for PAL or NTSC. Like PAL is 25 frames a second, NTSC is 30. I'm not sure how relevant they are these days with HDTV. I haven't lived in a PAL country in a very long time, but I believe they're still relevant. But typically now everything's either film, which is 24 frames a second. NTSC is more US. So US is 30 frames a second, 640 by 480, or NTSC was 720 by 576, 25 frames a second. So PAL's kind of superior, but the US standard NTSC is used in Canada as well. And yeah, so they're not as relevant. Film's 24 frames a second. But anyway, like if you merge something into a new scene file, it may have like a different frame rate set up, and it might mess up your frame rate or your frame lengths. So it's kind of good to know, like, oh, wait a minute, this is 70 to 414. Why is my shot different? You know, just easy ways to kind of detect if something was going wrong. So again, I just like to have a pretty accurate camera, so I know what shot it's coming from, just in case we're working on multiple shots in one file, as well as the frame length as well, so I know when a shot's going to cut. Because, like, let's say frame 70, if I pre-roll, I know I don't need to render anything before frame 70. You know, just stuff like that, just general good use. Okay, so that being said, we've got the camera all set up. All this is all set up. So there's other things to keep in mind too. Is we're going to need rotor. In other words, like we don't have any 3D geometry for some of the foreground elements, so we're going to need to protect them, like this pole here, this tower, these power lines, all that kind of stuff. So there's definitely additional things for comp that we need to consider, but for this should be pretty good. I'm going to click the layers again. One thing I might do is just right click on the Scene Explorer and just go dock to the left. And that way I just have this here, kind of like the outliner in Maya. And I can just turn some of this stuff back on so I have it all there. And at this point, like, we've got everything set up, good to go, and I want to start working on the effects. And I'm going to do this in phases, okay? So actually, one thing I might do is just the pillars, the pipes. So I might actually set up we can set up the material ID for that if we want. I'm not going to worry about it just yet, but I might come back and just set up those faces that are visible to be projected as well, and then the rest to be, regular CG shaders. I'll leave it for now. I'm not too concerned about it. Because again, like, this shot's going to be, we've got a lot going on, and I'm just going to focus where we need to for now. All right, so let's just save our work. I'm just gonna increment my save. So I just save like version 2, take 2. All right, and what I want to do now is I want to start working on the effects. Now, if you look at the layers, typically I have a lot more layers in here. I'll have like characters, I'll have assets like vehicles, things like that, depending on what I'm working with. But this to me is what I think we're going to need. I still number them how I would if I had everything in there, just because that way I know that 2 is environment, 5 is effects, and it just makes it very easy for me to kind of jump to where I need to, as well as for scripting, things like that as well. All right, so with effects selected, I'm just going to click new layer. And I don't think we're going to really need that many layers. Sometimes I'll have a lot of different effects in here. I kind of feel like all the destruction is going to be one layer. So I'm just going to say destruction controls. And then I might have another layer, which would be like destruction render. And it just means I have one layer, which would be the layer that gets rendered. So if I were to pass this onto the lighting department, let's say, they would know that they just need to have like the destruction render on and nothing else. So that could work really well. In this case, destruction render, keep that active. I'm going to just go to the create panel. Let's build our particle systems. So I'm going to go down to particle systems, thinking. Now you need thinking particles for this, obviously. I use every package out there. So whether it's Max, Maya, Houdini, I use everything. I've been using Max and Maya since like 98. I did mess around a little bit with prisms before that, which was Houdini's predecessor, as well as I used to mess around with Power Modeler, Power Animator, Dynamation, all those tools for like Wavefront as well for using, before Maya came around. And, same thing with Max. I was using 3ds DOS before that, and Povray, a lot of other tools like way back in the day. So, I've been using everything for a long time. I still really like Max and Thinking Particles and Fume Effects as like my go-to tools. A lot of the time. It really depends. So, look at studios like ILM or Scanline. They'll use Thinking Particles for all their destruction and for a lot of stuff. ILM these days is mixed. It's for effects, it'll be Houdini and it'll be Max. But Thinking Particles, Fume Effects, these are all industry standard tools that you'll see in most big movies coming out these days, especially Marvel films and other things that are requiring a lot of heavy-duty destruction. So, what I want to teach here is more industry standard tools, not, hey, Maya's awesome, so let's go use, whatever for it. I like Maya for some things, but I like fracture effects in Maya. I like fume effects in Maya. Phoenix is now in beta for Maya, which is awesome. I'm not a huge fan of Maya fluids. They were cool back in 03 when they first came out. Not a big fan now. They just haven't really improved too much. Bifrost is awesome. I was actually hanging out with one of the 2 guys who invented Naiad or Bifrost just last week. It's a really cool tool, but again, this depends on what you're doing. Pull down it, blast code, DMM, all those other destruction tools out there are pretty cool, but fracture effects is definitely my preference for Maya. But I wish it had Thinking Particles. I wish it had something like this. So this is our Thinking Particles node. I won't worry about naming it, but this is going to be in my render layer. So this is the one thing that I wanted to make sure goes into my destruction render. Now let's click here. See how these turn blue? I'm going to switch to destruction controls. So any additional stuff I drop in is going to get applied here. So for now, let's just start getting this set up. Okay. And one final thing I will say is that this is going to be fairly advanced. I want to try and explain everything as thoroughly as I can. And at the same time, I want to try and get through these fast. And we're going to be doing, this isn't ultra advanced, but it is pretty advanced what we're doing. So I want to let you know that if you feel at times like it's too complicated or you're falling behind, just go through the material again. I'm going to try and explain everything as thoroughly as I can. So it's just more about repetition. The more times you do this, the better you'll get. It doesn't always click right away. It might be the 5th time that you go through it, but then it's just like, oh, now everything just makes sense. I went to sleep one night, I woke up, and I just look at it all differently now. That is pretty common. So with the live action series, obviously we have a lot more time to kind of go into everything, but when I'm trying to go through something really quick, it's like right now, it's not quite the same story, but That's why I like with LAS or with the live action series that I run, that course, I have a lot of fundamental lessons which go through like the intro, the basics, the fundamentals, as well as all the advanced stuff. So that way, for anyone who's coming from a different package, you're able to get up to speed fast. And we have students who are coming from Maya and Houdini that are doing it all in Max, and they've never used it before, and they're able to get up to speed quick. Same deal, they can do it all in Maya or Max if they wanted, because the process is exactly the same in all of them. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into thinking particles, and we'll start to set everything up, which again is a bit of work to get everything set up, but once we're there, we'll have so much more control. Okay, so just select the TP node, or we can click it over here. Let's go to the modify panel and click properties, and this is going to bring up thinking particles. So TP is very, very powerful. At the same time, the design of it works, but it can be a little, like I said, it mightn't click right away if you've never used it before, but it works. There are definitely systems I like more that just you can think a bit more intuitively about stuff, but in general, it's very powerful in terms of what it can do. Now, like I said, I think the best way to do anything is to spend time up front and plan things out properly, rather than just diving in and making stuff and ending up with a big pile of whatever in the long run. So what I'd say is, let's just start to get the basics of our structure. And this is how I would code anything. This is how I would do things in general. Basically, we're dealing with groups. Groups are like buckets, so a particle can be in a bucket, and that's what it's in, and then it moves to a different one. Depending on what bucket, the conditions, the properties will all change. So typically, the way that I'll do things is I might have like a bunch of groups. The first one is going to be buildings. All right. Next one would be atmospherics. These are always the same. Okay. Another one might be secondaries, and I might move these around a little bit. We'll see. But the last one is MISC for miscellaneous. So that would typically be the way that I would work. Okay. Atmospherics, we might change it, but buildings is basically going to be everything pertaining to these buildings. So right now I just want to have one building. So I'm just going to call this guy underscore B1. And the reason for the underscore is that way, I'm just going to create a dynamic set for a second. If I were to say groups, you can kind of start to see the structure this way. Otherwise, like, it just drops everything out together. It doesn't really respect the hierarchy. So by having a lot of items done this way, it just makes life a heck of a lot easier, knowing that, like, I do underscore B1, I'm always going to have like a shape collision node, something like that. It just means I can see that these are all B1, blah, blah, blah. And as we get more complex, it's just going to be a lot easier to kind of be able to find stuff, as well as not accidentally put something in the wrong place, things like that. So right now I just want B1, which is going to be building 1. If we were to look at these buildings for a second, and we scroll over, I can easily say that this is building 1, this is building 2, this is building 3, this is building 4. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I just want to label these really quick. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how I'm going to do it. All right, and this should just make everything a bit easier. I mean, there's 4 buildings. I'm going to start with B1, which will be building 1. So all we're doing is we're basically setting this up where these where our particle groups will live. So right now, a majority of these are going to be in B1 for building 1. Okay. Typically, for something like this, I think what we'll end up doing is do like B1 underscore dumb for dumb particles. I'll explain all of this. And B1 MISC. And typically, I might just do these as double dashes. And this is only because that way it represents the top of the tree. Okay, so this is usually what I do just to kind of stay consistent. And again, if I were to go in here, we could see that the grouping makes a lot more sense, hopefully. All right, so at this point, I have the B1 stuff, and I'm also going to have collisions. So we're going to have like B1, but I'm also going to then have collisions, and this would be for everything. So I just put in collisions. Now this will essentially be where everything begins, because initially I want everything to be a collidable object that's static, unyielding, doesn't move, and then bit by bit we activate it and it becomes dynamic. That's how I like everything usually to work. So I know we're getting a bit of ahead of ourselves here, but basically SC is going to be anything dynamic. So anything that's going to fall and require like shape collisions, things like that, it's going to go in here. Dumb means that it's part of building one, but they're dumb particles. That's a term for particles that were, they're not fluids, they're not rigid bodies, they're not anything intelligent. They're essentially going to have a gravity, velocity, shape, size, just pretty basic properties assigned to them. That's where they're going to go, okay? And miscellaneous is miscellaneous. So in other words, this would be things like helpers or just stuff that isn't really used in the scene. So right now, it might make sense, but as we go through this, hopefully it will. Just under collisions, this is the only bit where I am going to jump ahead a little bit. I want to put, I'm putting a C for collisions. So again, I just can know where everything's going. We have the ground. I'm also going to have the ramp. Technically, I could just do them as one. Maybe I'll just do that. I'll do them as C, ramp. So this is the ramp and this is the ground, okay? So just easy to kind of distinguish between the two. Finally, one more thing. I'm just going to put in B1, or let's say C, B1, all right? So that's just building one collisions. And if we look through the environment, we've got a bunch of different stuff in here. I want these to all be in individual groups so I know where they're going. It's really important so that way I can have as much control as I can. So I'm probably going to need about 4 groups. I'm going to put double underscore B1, and then we'll put, so I'm going to do C, B1, pillars. And I'm just going to name all of these now so they're really easy to set up. So I'm going to say walls, floor, and roof. Okay, so these are our groups. So we have the floor, we have the pillars, the pipes, which right now I'm not worried about, the roof, and the walls. So this is where they're all going to go. All right, so right now we're going to start to bring all the geometry in, and I want to put them in the corresponding groups so that way we can start to construct this. So we haven't done anything yet. Treat this like a folder structure. We're just setting up all the folders so we can start copying files to the right place. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to set up this here as building one. So this was our groups. This is our master dynamic. This is where all the operators go. This is just how we kind of tag them essentially. So building one, I'm just going to set up initially, I'm going to call it 1 underscore prefrag. And the reason for this is that bit by bit, I'm going to layer this stuff up. So I always put numbers so I can see the hierarchy. Anyway, so this is where I'm going to prefrag everything. And essentially going to import the geometry. And in fact, we could just call it that if it makes more sense. Import geo. And then we can just say, let's say create geo, whatever we wanted to do. Usually call it import geo, so I'll say read geo. Okay, so what we'll do here is we're actually going to bring in all the geometry, and then we want to kind of set it all up. So initially I'm just going to go in here. So we have this read geo. Again, these are like folders. Read geo, I'm just going to drop in, so right click, operators, generator, object to particle. And now what object to particle does is it will bring in all the objects and create particles out of them. So here, what I want to do is let's bring in the roof first. So I just want to double click on the roof, and then here click pick, and then we'll just say select by name. So do that again, pick, select by name, and then just hit pick. All right, and it's just going to drop all of my selection in. Okay, now we need to actually tell where to go, because you know, everything that we've done here is just getting set up. We're just doing it ahead of time, so we have a bit of structure. But right now, all we've done is we just created this building one import regio. Okay, so this is the only thing we've done so far is this object to particle. And what I want to do is I'm going to click at the very top and select, just hold down select. I'm going to select all of these items. And let's do two things. Let's enable instance shape, which means it's going to read the geometry shape in. But the other thing is I want to choose where this actually goes. So these are all roof objects. So I'm going to put this into the roof group here that we have. Okay. So I'm going to hide my geometry for a second. So let's turn that all off. So it's all hidden. All that's visible is my TP node. Now if I just go back to the beginning, we can see the roof geometry is now imported. Okay, so let's just cut to this view. Everything that was in the roof group is now a particle. We can see it's got a little tick representing the particle. So the next goal is I don't actually want it to be everything here right now. I just want it to be probably just this guy. So I just want to explain what that does. All right, so I'm going to do this again really quick. Let's just enable the roof. So I'm going to hide all this stuff. All right, so with the roof though, I'm just going to click the bits that are what I consider to be building one. All right, so these are all building one. I'm just going to add, select by name, hit enter, and that's just going to add them in. So this is all building one stuff. So again, just drop it into building one, roof, instance shape, then we can hide that roof stuff. Now, for it to update, I just need to like, you know, move it back and forward, and that's going to refresh it. Okay, it's going to calculate it again. But now we can see we got the geometry in here. And maybe I'm going a little bit basic here. I don't know. Like, I want to just over-explain this stuff for anyone who's not familiar with it. But all we're doing is we're just importing the geometry. I'm going to now rename this to B1 roof. So I'll pick up the pace a little bit. I'm just going to drop in another one. This time, let's do the walls. So I'm going to turn off TP. Just right-click to turn it off. All right, so I just want to select in the wall only group anything that I consider to be building one. All right, so got them selected. Pick, select by name, hit it, and then select them all. Instance shape, it's really important. Otherwise, I won't have any shape. And we'll choose wall, and that goes into the wall group. All right, so now I can hide them. And I'll rename this to B1 walls. Okay, two more. So object to particle. If I want to duplicate this, I can hold shift, left click, drag, and it's going to duplicate it. Because I know I'm going to need 4, right? Like pillars and the floor and all that stuff. I don't know if I actually will use the pillars, but I want to still have them set up so that way I can just easily turn it on if I need to. So say floors, and got the floors here. So this is building one. Pick, select the floors, instance shape, floors, or floor, whatever. And so that's done. Finally, the pillars. So I just want to identify which is which. So I think it's all of these ones. Okay, so B1 pillars. Now there's going to be a lot of these guys, so it might take a moment to read them all in. Try that again. So I'm going to select them all. Pillars, instance shape. Okay, so I'm going to hide everything again, turn my TP on. Now we should see all of building one is imported. Okay, now right now the wireframe is all white because if I click on any of these groups, it shows up white. So if I want to, I could get pillars here, click color, and we could change this to be more of a dark gray. Let's do like 30. Okay, now we can see that the pillars have turned gray. So I'm just going to right click, copy that color, and we'll right click on the walls. So we'll click on the walls and right click over here, paste. Now the walls are gray. Paste again for the floor, the roof. And typically, I just want to color code all of these so that way I can tell what group they're in based on the color. The other thing is I'm just going to go to B1, right click, paste, and I'm going to do this to everything in the collision group. I want to easily be able to see anything that's gray is a collision. Okay, it will just make it a lot easier later. If I can look at a gray particle, I know instantly that's an unmoving, static collision object. So now that we've done that, okay, I could, it's taken a bit of work to get this far, but we've done it in a way where everything is neatly set up, where I can easily turn things on off here, like the pillars. Let's turn them off. So I'm going to right click just to turn that off. Now I refresh this, all the pillars go away. Okay, so I'm going to keep the pillars off. I can also right click, turn it off there as well, because I just want to deal with this basic geo. So the next step for me is once we've imported this geo, it's all working, I want to now look at building some beams. So if I go back to the destruction controls, make sure it's active. All right, so in the top viewport, so I'm just switching to my top, I hit T is my hotkey. Otherwise, you can just click and change here. But I'm just going to go to the create panel, helpers, point. Okay, so what a point is, I'm just going to click and move it into position. What a point is basically like a locator, a dummy, a null, depending on what package you're using. It's just a way I can use the position, orientation, stuff like that. So I just want to move this to wherever I want it to be. What I want this to represent is a laser beam that's going to shoot down from the sky. So I want to make sure it's high enough that it's not in the viewport. So if I look in the viewport, I want to move it out of the range of the sky, like out of the camera view. And I just want to position this above where I want a laser to shoot down. Okay, same deal. I'm going to hold shift. I'm going to drag it. Choose copy. So we got these 2 points. We can name them if we want. I'm just going to be lazy for now. But basically, these will represent laser beams, or the position of where the lasers will be. So the second one, I could do it more in this second part of the structure. So one's going to hit there, one's going to hit there. Okay, now let's go back into import geometry. I'm going to create a new layer, and let's call this create beam position. So create beam pos. All I'm going to do here is I'm simply going to right click helpers standard node. All right, and you can also do it this way. Just hit tab, type in node, and this allows me to bring something in. So I can just pick node and choose an item. So we can see point 1, which is this guy. And then I'm going to create a particle exactly where it is. So again, position born, we'll be using a lot of these. I want to choose where this is going to get created. So I feel like if we went to, because it's like building 1, I'm going to go to under MISC. I'm going to create an item here. And let's just call this _1 _ beam origin and then off. Okay, because we're initially going to create all these beams, but they're not going to be on. They're not going to be activated. And then we'll tell them when we want them to turn on. Okay, so initially we have that. So because we're going to have multiple beams, I'm going to create a few of them. So I'll create 2 for now because we have 2. I'm just going to say _1 _ B origin 1. Copy the name the second one. We'll call this beam origin 2. So we're just naming all this stuff so it's very easy to have as much control as possible. Now, with the position born, all I need to do is these are the inputs and these are the outputs. So in other words, if we need to spit information out, we will get it from output. But input is stuff that it's looking to have. So in this case, I want the position to come from here. So the node, point 1, this guy here, we're going to feed the position into this particle system. If I update this now, we can see we have particles emitting from that point. Okay, but I don't want that to happen. I just want one particle. So I'm going to say pistol shot. And pistol shot means it's just going to fire once, okay? And the other thing is I need to say, where is this particle going? So we're going to put it into that B origin. Now, it might be hard to see, but there's one particle, you can kind of see it there, shooting up. So let's hide our points. So just turning them off, so we just see this one particle. Now, I'm going to give it a lifespan. So these are all the properties of the particle system. Let's make it live for like 350 frames. 0 speed, so it's not actually going to move. It's just going to stay in place. Now, we can see we have this one particle appearing exactly where the helper is. So hopefully that makes sense. We're just getting the position from here and dropping it into the position born. If it makes sense, we can rename this. So like right-click, rename, and we just say beam origin 1. And if you wanted to, you could call this like 0.001. At least then you know where they're coming from. Okay, I don't really care about that kind of thing, but you know, if it was something I was sharing with other people, I would at least like make sure everything's named very carefully. So another thing is, if I want to, I can double click to compact this down. You know, I'm not going to go through the really basic stuff of TP, but hopefully this kind of helps a little bit. Okay, so that's created one laser. We'll do the other one later on. I'm not too concerned about it just yet. Okay, so now that we've, the reason we've done this is so that way we know like where the laser beam can shoot down from. The next thing I want to do is I actually want it to be able to detect where the laser hits. So even though we're not going to turn it on yet, I want to be able to fire this laser down from above. So it's going to try and draw in a straight line, even though my wacom is going diagonally. It's going to shoot all the way down, and I want it to detect a collision here. The reason for that is obviously later on we're going to have it like rip the ground up. But for now, because like fracturing everything is a pretty slow process at times, I want to initially pre-frag the geo. So I want to be able to tell the geometry in this area to be broken already, and that way later on when we're doing it, all we're doing is we're going to be activating this area. So this whole area is going to be pre-fractured ahead of time. So to do that, I want to know where the beam would connect with. So I'm going to create another operation here, and bit by bit we're building a much more complex system. Right now we have a particle, but it's attached here. We have all the other geometry brought in as particles, so we know what to affect. Now I'm going to simply say beam, and then what do we want to call this? We could call this, I guess we call like collision detection or detect. So beam, col, detect. It doesn't sound very fun, but at least it's something that's very obvious, like the beam, collision, detect. Or we could even put in like a Z if we wanted. Whatever we needed to do to kind of get this all working properly. So with this here, we have this one point, and then we have all these particles on the ground, okay? And I want to fire an invisible ray down just to purely find a surface to collide with, so it kind of knows like where that's going to be. So to do that, I need these two particles to be able to talk to each other. So the easiest way to do that is a p-pass AB, and that allows me to get particle A, particle B, and I can feed information that can talk back and forth with each other. So in this case, what I would do is I would say intersect, okay? And intersect just fires an invisible ray at something. And when it intersects, when it hits, it's able to record all that information to be able to use. So that way you could use this for crowds if you wanted to have like a particle moving through an environment, and it would be able to fire out rays everywhere and figure out, okay, well, there's a wall, and slowly try and figure out how to get around, you know, for instance, or whatever you wanted to do with it. In this case, what I want to do is I basically want to get the position. Well, let's set this up so like particle A could be the origin. So I'm going to say anything in the beam origin off. So that way, if I add more beams later on, it's automatically going to use them because it will respect the hierarchy. So anything in here is going to respect. Okay, and the other thing is it's going to look for roofs because again, it's going to be from above. So let's look specifically at roofs. Okay. All right. So we've done that. And lastly, we just need to see that this is going to work. So I'm going to get the position from particle A, which is this particle up here. I'm going to get the shape from particle B because it needs to collide with the shape here. We need to give it a direction. So I'm going to drop in 0.3, which is XYZ. Okay, so I could give this -1 direction and just plug that into direction. So now it's going to shoot down. Okay. Finally, we need to set up on the intersect speed is ray length and give this like, I don't know, 200, some kind of value where it's going to shoot fairly, fairly long. Let's say 300. Now we won't really know that this is working right away. So what I need to do is I need to drop in another position born because I can get the position from here, and that way we can see that these particles are now happening on the ground. So hopefully this makes sense. Right now we have 0.1 and is just firing a ray. Sorry, can't draw in a straight line from here, but firing a ray directly down, and that is feeding, like when it gets a hit, it's feeding the position in here, right? So from there, it's emitting particles based on the position it's fed. Okay, so in this case, again, I don't need lots of particles. I just want one. But what it means is that, and again, I'll set the speed to 0 and lifespan 350. It's the same deal as before. Cool thing is that now we just have like one particle being shot down. Okay, and that's pretty handy just because it means that I could move this wherever I want. And as soon as I update the system, we can see it's now positioned in the new location. If I want this to be in real time, like Maya's particles, you got to like refresh it and it'll recalculate. Max's particles typically are all real time. There's advantages to both. Some finicky things I might want them to be in real time. Complicated things I'd probably want to turn it off. If I go to the master dynamic, I can turn edit on the fly off, and that means that it will now be real time. So now if I move this around, we can see that it's detecting where that collision is on the ground. So it's firing this ray down and detecting that, which is kind of cool. Now, because we're only running this once, I can actually take this a step further because you might notice there's a little bit of lag happening now, partially because it's got to like detect the collision area. So I can do a particle age. This is a condition, so saying only when the particle is first created. So if we click on particle age, when it's born, we can tell the intersect only to run that one time and then never again, rather than constantly firing rays everywhere. So to do that, we have inputs. I'm going to left click and there's an on, so we can make that exposed and connect it. So what's going to happen is this condition, it's going to check the particle. It's going to say, all right, you were born, so in that case, let's turn this intersect on. So now it's a lot quicker just because it's only doing it that one time. All right, so pretty handy. Now, I want this ray to be kind of at the front, probably somewhere in the middle, about there. Okay, just so that way it's going to be cool. We get to see some of the front of the building getting ripped apart. And it's also cool just that because this is red, we can kind of see what is the front of the building. But if I were to go into this viewport, we're basically going to get this ray shooting down. It's going to hit here. We see that white point. It's going to rip it apart. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we haven't actually set up where this particle is going yet. All right, so that's the next thing that I need to do is to actually give it a home. And so to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, where do I want to put this? I'm going to put this into I guess, into the MISC as well. So I'm going to put another group, and this group is going to be, sorry, 1_beam hit pos. And then we're going to have at least 2 of these, so 2 underscores, beam hit pos off, and then we'll have beam hit pos on. Now the reason for this is because initially I don't want these doing anything, okay? I don't want them actually doing anything other than just sitting there. But later on, I'm going to have a beam come down, and it's going to hit that building, and when it does, I want this to then turn on, and that's going to actually activate it. It's going to rip the building apart. This is going to be something that we're kind of slowly building up to. So initially I'm going to drop this into beam hit pos off, and that should be cool. Now the other thing that I wanted to do, let me rename this to beam hit pos. Might as well put off. Is once it creates that, I still want to fracture everything, and this is why we're doing it this way. Right now, like, I'm not going to have anything dynamic happening. It's just figuring out where the laser will be coming from, and it's firing a ray down around it, okay? So the other thing is that when it's on the ground, I actually want it to pre-break the ground up around it, so that way when it is time, it's already broken because we can cache all this stuff. There's one other thing is that right now that might look very straight. So one thing I haven't done yet is, if we look at the direction, there's a bit of a variation here. Let's set that to 0 so that way it's a straight line down. Same deal with the beam origin, just in case we can say variation down. I'm just going to do that just as a precaution. I don't think it will really affect things, but I just want to be 100% sure. Yeah, it's more to do with the speed, but which it doesn't have any. But the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create some cells. So another position born, I'm going to rename this one to cells. Now, cells are going to be what we're going to use to generate all the fracturing. Basically what's going to happen is I'm going to fire from here down onto the ground. So straight down. Going to determine to try and do a straight line, but I can't from this angle. So it's going to fire a straight line down, and then it's going to use that to generate all of these points, which is essentially how a Voronoi fracture works, is it generates points to figure out how to cut everything. And then from there, it's going to start to fracture everything based on that. So what we're going to do is we're going to pre-frag the geometry on the surface here, so that way it's completely broken. So that way it doesn't need to calculate it later. All right. So based on that, I have these cells. I'm going to plug the position in here, so it's going to get this initial position. And let's just create some cells. So I'm going to call this, I don't know, B1 roof cells. Pretty sure I just call this VB cells for volume breaker, just because I don't think there's going to be any other cells I'm using. And so these cells, these clusters of points, I'm going to drop them into cells. I'll set the lifespan to 1. We don't need to live very long. I'm going to set the speed to 0 because I don't need them to move. And what we get is just a particle, a bunch of particles. So the next step though is, if we set the emission distance to 300, I don't know, something big, we should get a bunch of particles being generated. So, or I mean, in a range. I'm gonna go pistol shot, and let's just say percol, and let's set this to like 3500. All right, so now we can see the particles. So they're only on for 1 frame, but this is what's happening. So this emission distance, if I bring this down, you can see this is the distance, and this is the angle. All right, so if we set this to 0 on the angle variation, we just have this distance. So I could set this distance to be something, I don't know, a little bit higher. Okay, so let's say going to set it to like 40, but I'm going to set the variation to 100. So here's where it's interesting, because we're randomizing the range, okay? And then we can do the angle to 360. And what we get is just a cluster, a spherical cluster of particles, all right? So this is essentially our blast radius, is what's going to get ripped apart. Anything in this building area is going to get broken, okay? And it's based on the distance, and we're varying that distance. And there's the particle count, all that stuff. So those are cells, and cells are going to rip everything apart. So hopefully, you know, all of this is making sense. All we did is initially create a particle on the helper. We used that to figure out where the laser would detect on the ground. And then we use that to generate some cells, which now we're going to use to break it all apart. Okay, so that's going to be the next step, is to actually fracture everything. So finally, just for now, I'm going to use less cells, just because it's going to be quicker, but we will bring it up again. So let's try 350 just to test this out. Now the next step is I'm going to come in and do pre-frag. So we're going to fracture the ground. So here I'm going to get the roof. I'm going to get a volume breaker. Volume breaker allows it to break everything, break the volume. So it's going to fracture everything. So by doing that already, we can kind of see that it creates some really basic cuts on the geo, nothing too complex. The next step is going to be, if we were to adjust the Voronoi, it's going to cut things more, but we're not going to actually use that at all. Instead, I'm going to use cells, and I'm going to choose the VB cells. So now the cuts are actually happening where these particles are. So if I were to move this now, we can see the cuts happen where the laser is hitting it. All right, and everything looks fine. It's just it's going to break it into pieces. So the next step would be that right now, if we were to look at particles, you don't see they're all still just one particle. So for this to actually separate it all, I'm going to need to set the activation to 100, and that's going to create all these separate particles. So you can see now there's a particle for every piece that's cut up. So you can see there's lots more. The other thing is we need to give it a home. Okay, so I'm going to need to tell this to, like when it breaks it all, to go somewhere. So going back to SC, I'm going to create a few groups here, and I want to name these a bit better. We don't need to do anything just yet, but I'm going to call this like B1, and then we'll say 1 VB1. All right, and then we can actually get rid of that 1, say B1 VB2. I guess we're not really making this too complex, so like I can keep it pretty simple. So we got VB1 and VB2. Right now, the volume breaker, it's coming from B1 roof. I'm just going to drop it back in the same group. So B1 roof, so it stays gray. But I do want to set up these where when it breaks, I'm going to make this turn, like we'll know that things are activated because they'll turn green. And then we'll know they're activated a second time because they'll turn blue, okay? So this is what the VB ones, we're not doing anything with them yet, but we will. So right now I've managed to break the roof. I'm going to turn off the edit on the fly, just so that way it's not real time anymore. Going back in here, I'm going to select it all, hold Control Shift, and duplicate twice. And let's just do the walls, and we'll make it go back into the walls group. And we'll also do the floor. So the floor going back into the floor group. So let me just refresh this, and now we can see that not only was the ceiling, the roof, broken, but now the floors and the walls are all broken as well. So this is all working correctly. It's all doing its job based on that point going to here, then generating all the surrounding points, and that's then filtering in and breaking everything apart. Okay, So what about our second laser? Because we also had that other one here. Why don't we just go back now and put something in there? So going back to create beam pause, I'm going to Control Shift, duplicate the setup, and this time select this one, and then change this to B origin 2. So let's try this again now. I'm going to take a look at this. Let me make sure it's actually above something. So one thing I just want to double check with this, with the beam, I actually want to do it per call. Otherwise, it's just going to fire one point out. But I actually want to do per call. And then what should happen is each time it's called, obviously it's going to fire out that point. So let me turn off prefrag for a second just to test this. Okay, so now we're seeing this many points. So that's just going to quickly fire those out, and that's going to fracture everything. So now it's going to get a little bit slow just because when I turn this on, it's going to fracture in 2 different locations. So before I do that, I'm just going to move this guy over a little bit. I'm going to fire the laser down in this area because I wouldn't mind ripping that area and that area apart. All right, so I'm going to turn on prefrag, and I'll let this calculate for a moment, and it's just going to shoot from these 2 laser points. These little points here, it's going to create the cells, and it's going to fracture everything. Okay, now I'll go 1 frame ahead because the cells only last for 1 frame, and we can see that we can distinctly see exactly where each one is being broken from. Plus there's a little point representing it there as well, so we can call other effects to happen in those areas. So this is cool, but it does take a good 30 seconds or whatever. So this is why I made this all inclusive. I put a number there because I want to cache this now. I'm going to cache this to disk, which means that we don't need to recalculate this every time. It's only if we modify this setup that we need to recalculate it. So I'm just going to right click and choose cache record, and this will cache it out. If I wanted to, I could just do 1 frame, okay? And that might be useful in certain situations where I only want to, cache out a single frame because, I don't need the animation. I just need that 1 frame done. I don't really care that much, but if I did, I would just make the frames all 70, so it's 1 frame long for now. I'm just going to say cache record and just save this out, and it will take 40 seconds or however long to do the initial fracturing for the first frame, and then after that it's just going to write out the rest of the animation, which, like I said, if I wanted to do 1 frame, then that's all it would do, and the size of the cache would probably be smaller than as well. But for simplicity, I'm just going to cache the entire thing. Okay, so let's look. This took 41 seconds to do, at least for me. It might have been slower for you. It just depends. But keep in mind, we don't actually have that much geometry right now fracturing, so I might actually up the cells being created so that we can get a lot more detail into this. Okay, even though I kind of feel like this isn't too bad. Let's just roll with this for now, but if I ever need to update it, I just go to right click and hit record, and it's going to update it. So I may go back and do that. For now, I'm going to go back to building 1. We have that entire system all packaged up, cached, good to go. And the next step is going to be to actually create the beams. Now, visually, we're going to create the beams later. We're going to make some really cool laser beams shooting down, creating all the reverse gravity, all that stuff. For now, let's just focus on getting some kind of physical beam going. So what I'll do is I'm going to, in here, create activate beam on. And so what this will do is we're actually going to turn the beams on because we have beam origin off. Okay, so let's go and create a beam origin on. So I'm going to say _2 beam origin on. So in here, I'm going to simply get each beam, because I want to control them individually. So there's beam origin 1 and beam origin 2. And let's now set a status for these. So we can turn them to the new group, okay? And I'm going to simply put in a group which they can go to. I'm going to duplicate this. So this just tells it to go to a new group. So with B origin 1, I'm going to set this to B origin 1, but on. Same deal, I'm going to turn this on to 2. So to make this a bit easier to see, we have these 2 points. Let's set up some colors. So I'm going to set up the beam origin initially to be black, okay? I think that's going to make it a bit easier. I'll set this one to black as well. I'll set this to black. Now, if I were to turn this group off, we can see that they're black. When I turn it on, they turn white. So let's change this to green. I'm going to copy paste the colors. But this just simply means that we'll be able to tell when they're activated, okay? So now, because this is on, they're green. Turn it off, they turn black. So let's control it where we can control the time. Okay, so we can say at frame 120, one of them turns on. I'm simply going to do a time interval and set this to 120. And then I'm going to simply do it again here. So let's expose the on, link these up. And then this one though, I'm going to do, I don't know, let's try like 160, something a bit longer. Now what's going to happen is these are black. And then as we go ahead, frame 120 and then frame 160, this is going to turn green. Okay, so that color change simply means that these are now activating. Okay, so the next step is going to be to actually create the shape of these as well. So let's see, right now we could probably just do it all. Yeah, we'll do it separately. So I'm going to assign a shape to this. So we'll call this beam shape. And we're simply going to get the whole beam on group. Sorry, where are we? Beam on. And I'm going to initially, let's see, we're going to throw in a shape. So standard shape. For now, let's just make these cubes. So I'm going to give this a cube shape. And I'm just going to throw in size, scale, alignment. Pretty basic stuff. So the size, let's just make these 10. Okay, scale. Let's do something pretty tiny. 4,500 in length. So now we're getting this, which is cool. Alignment, I guess it's actually aligned correctly. So maybe we don't need to worry about alignment. So for now, this will work. We'll set something up later, which is a bit more attractive, but for now, that should work pretty well. So if we're to go to the camera viewport, what's going to happen is at frame 120, we'll get that beam turn on. And frame 160, we'll get the next beam turn on. So where were you? 58, 59, there we go, 60. So now we have these two beams coming down, and we can see exactly where they're going to pierce into the building. So if we look, this is exactly where all the detail is being cut into the geometry. All right, so we have the beam, we've got it activating. The next thing that I want to do is I basically want to tell this to create like an area of destruction. So when this thing hits, I then want to create like a sphere, and the sphere is going to grow over time. And that's simply going to symbolize like an area to activate and tell it to break apart and the attraction to happen, all those things. So to do that, I initially want to use this beam, and because it's firing right down, there's this little point that we have still. And what I want to do is I basically want to use the shape of the beam and say, hey, now you're inside of this mesh, I want you to turn on. Because this beam comes down and covers it, I can say now you're inside of it, turn on, and I want to create like a sphere. And I want that sphere to expand out. And as this sphere, what am I doing? Let me zoom out a little bit. As the sphere comes out, I want to use that to say, well, if you're inside of this mesh that's going to be expanding, then I want you to activate, or maybe I want you to break more into smaller pieces even more. Okay, so it's going to fracture it even more. Now, as that happens, I'm going to have a second sphere growing out, not as fast. And that one is going to say anything inside of it is going to activate, and those pieces are all going to raise up into the air. Okay, so that's going to be the plan here, is that we'll have two spheres. One will break everything, and the second one will activate it and release it to float in the air. Okay, and it's all going to happen because we have that little point, and that little point is inside of this laser, and so therefore we can use it to turn it on. Okay, so I'm going to create a few more groups, and let's just call this ground activator, something like that, I don't know. And so I might do like a P-pass AB, because I basically want to get the cylinder, the beam, as one, and then the original origin point. Okay, so we have the, where is it? The beam hit pause. Is that right? Or the, yeah, I guess it would be the beam hit pause. And the other one would be the beam shape, which I guess is the beam origin on. Okay, so beam origin on and beam hit pause off. Might be a bit confusing. And we do an in mesh. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to send it to a new group. So I'm going to say the beam hit pause on is going to go, oh sorry, off is going to go into the beam hit pause on. I'm going to get the position from there, particle shape from the cylinder, and then activate it there. Alright, so I'll walk through this in a moment, but let's just color code these as well. So beam hit pause off. Let's make this pink, and then on we'll make bright green. So when the cylinder comes down at around frame 120, this pink color is now going to be inside of the beam, so it's going to then turn it on. It's going to go to this new group. So when it does that, we can tell it to then do the next step, which is once it's turned on, we can then have it create a bunch of spheres that can grow out. Okay, so we'll say beam hit pause on, and I'm just going to do a position born. And there's going to be one, like I said, is the fragging, and the other one's the activator. So I'm going to say radius, let's call it rad, R-A-D, and then fragger, and then I'll rename the top one to rad activator. So I'm going to pull the position, but let's just do it so it creates it once. So I'm just going to simply say particle age. Same deal. And just to be safe, I'm going to make it enters group here. So both of these just enters group. All right, so with this rad activator, I'm just going to tell this to pistol shot per call, but do like 500 frames or 350, whatever. 0 speed, just the standard stuff that I've done before. Per call, pistol shot, 500, 0 speed. So it's going to create both of these. I don't know, I'm just going to say rads. Rad short for radius, but it doesn't really make sense there. But the cool thing is that these are going to be given a shape and they're going to expand out. So initially, let's set up the, let's say the fragger. So I'm also going to need to assign like where they're going, because I haven't actually done that yet. So in the MISC, let's call this VB radfrag. Maybe I can keep these a bit more consistent, but let's call it radfrag. Sorry, I'm going back and forth on this. So I'm just gonna have two. I'm gonna have one which is the fragger and one's the activator. I should probably put an underscore in front of them. Actually, I'm gonna put 2 underscores. Just to keep this consistent. Just that way. And you know, we can start to see there's a bit of a hierarchy and just makes it easier to kind of tell where's what. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to get the initially I'm going to need to tell these where to go. So the activator, I'm going to send to activator, fragger to fragger. Then here I can get the fragger. I'm going to give it a shape. I'll give it a size. And let's just give it a shape of like a sphere. Make it 10 for now, just so we can see what it's doing. So when this turns on, which will be frame 120, we can see that now we have a sphere created, okay? So that's going to be the fragging sphere. So maybe initially I could set this to be like 30, something a lot bigger, and it just means we have that. Same deal, I'm going to select, Control-Shift, duplicate. I'm going to need a bit of room here, but this one I could set to activator, and we can set the size to be half the size, so 15. Now, this is just a purely a concept sketch, but it means that what's inside of here is going to break, and then the activator one is going to activate those to make them suck up in the air. Okay, so let's do that now. I'm going to get these so that way they grow over time. They're not going to initially start out that size. They'll start small and grow over time. So the way that I want to do that is I'm going to need to do a little bit of messing around here. So initially I want to make a size. I'm just going to plug in a float, and we'll just call this init size for the initial size. And this is a size value that I want to give initially when it starts out. So we could set this to be 35, something like that. And what's going to happen, and like let's do this one here, I'm going to make this like 80. So if we wanted, we could plug this directly in. When we refresh this, this is what we're going to get, okay? And let's just set up the values as well. I'm going to make the fragger red, and we'll make the activator green. So I just want to set this up as a concept, but what I want to do is actually want this to grow over time. So the easiest way to do that is always going to be to initially get my value, and I want to plug in a timer. Okay, now I'm going to use an egg timer. It's a weird name, but egg timer, because essentially that can start. Okay, and then it can feed out the time. So let me do a add multiply. You can feed out the time into here, and essentially we can then divide that by the initial size. Okay, so I'm going to plug the size in here. So we've got this add multiply, we've got this egg timer. The egg timer, we can choose how long that goes for. I might limit it to 150 frames. So what's going to happen is it gets the initial size, and as you can see now it's growing based on that. So the initial size is good because that way we know what size, like partially, it's going to be when it first gets created, and then it's going to grow over time. Now I could then control the time of that as well. Okay. Okay, so pretty simple. Let me just get a bit of room here so we can do this properly. All right, so just another add multiply, and another, this could be our time. So I'm just reorganizing this a little bit. So let's put the initial size in here, and instead we'll duplicate this, and we'll just say time divider, and we can plug that in. So the whole point is that I could have a time divider. So this is a way to divide the time up. So that should be divided, but then I'm going to multiply the values together. So basically I start with my initial size, and I'll get this value here, which is increasing over time, but I want to divide this by a certain value. It doesn't matter, it's purely just going to change. Like if this was over 10 frames going from 1 to 10, if we divided it, let's say by 50, or it's essentially going to count slower. So the value is going to be slower, and then we multiply these together. So in other words, it just mightn't expand as quick, depending on what we're trying to do. Oh, and the last thing I just realized I should have done is keep these connected, but I want to put the size initially in. Cool. So I just realized I'm messing this up. So I just forgot I need to make that divided. I thought I already had, because this is multiplied at the end, but we want to divide this down. Okay, so let me just explain this again. I apologize, I'm getting a bit off track with this. Okay, so this is going to bring in, choose a better color. This is going to bring in the value. It's going to be the time. So the time obviously is going to start at 70, and it'll work its way up from there. Or technically it's moving along the timeline, but it's going to start, it's going to move progressively up. But we want to then divide this value by this time divider. So in other words, we're able to, by increasing this, we're going to make the time slow down, or the value slow down. And then we're simply then getting the init size, and we're multiplying that by this here, so t divided by td, I guess, and that will be our end result. So that'll be our size. Okay, so essentially this here will be whatever size we want to put in. This controls how quickly it expands. Those are the two values we need to keep in mind. But by doing that, so this is dividing and this is multiplying, and we plug that in the size here. Hopefully this works. Yeah, there we go. Cool. And we're going to do the exact same setup again. All right. So let's just tidy this up just a little bit. Usually I make the inputs pretty visible so they're easy to kind of see. But I'm going to get all of this, at least these guys, Control Shift, duplicate, and start. And let's put in the particle as well. size here. And so the initial size I think is going to be about 80 and 70 because we don't want to expand as quick. Okay, so there we have these two expanding. One's going to frag it, or sorry, yeah, essentially activate it. The other one's going to frag it.